The first time Daniel Reyes told a room full of powerful people, "No." His voice shook, but it carried. TV cameras were rolling. Council members stared over their nameplates, caught off guard. Two corporate lawyers in $1,000 suits froze halfway to the podium. And in the back row, his 10-year-old daughter was clutching her inhaler with white knuckles, eyes locked on her father like he was the only solid thing in the room. The mayor had just called for a vote to approve a new chemical processing plant on the edge of town. Jobs tax breaks, economic revival. Those were the buzzwords stamped on the glossy brochures. What nobody on that dais wanted to talk about was the plume of haze that would drift over the elementary school on still summer mornings, or the fact that kids like his daughter Sophia were already gasping their way through gym class. So when the company's lead spokesperson smiled into the microphone and said, "Our safety standards are the best in the country," Daniel stood. He hadn't planned a speech. He was wearing his city maintenance uniform boots, still dusty from patching a broken water main. But he stepped into the aisle anyway, raised his hand, and said, "My name is Daniel Reyes. My crew keeps your water clean, and you're lying to us. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from tonight, and hit that like and subscribe button if you believe courage still matters in this world." Daniel was 37, the year all of this began, old enough to feel the weight of every wrong decision, young enough to still think he could make a difference. By day, he supervised a small team for the city's water department, wrench in one hand, clipboard in the other, crawling into pump stations most residents never knew existed. By night, he packed lunches, checked homework, and sat on the edge of a worn-out couch, while Sophia fell asleep with her head on his leg, and a science documentary playing too quietly on the TV. They lived in a 2-bedroom rental on the south side of Millstone, Ohio, a steel town that had watched its mills rust into skeletons. His wife, Lena, had died 5 years earlier after a vicious, fast-moving cancer that the doctors called bad luck. Daniel didn't buy that. Not when half the guys from his old shift at the metalworks carried the same scars from radiation and chemo. Not when the creek behind their first apartment had run strange colors after every heavy rain. What he didn't say out loud, not even to himself, was that he carried guilt like a permanent weight in his chest. Guilt that he'd kept his head down back when those same factories were dumping who knew what into the water because they needed the paycheck. Guilt that he hadn't asked harder questions before Lena got sick. Under the grease-stained uniform and the quiet, tired eyes was a man who knew infrastructure better than any politician in town. He could look at a blueprint and tell you exactly where a system would fail, how a spill would travel, whose basement would flood first. He kept that expertise to himself most days, tucked behind a shrug and a "yes, sir" when a supervisor waved off his concerns. It was easier that way. What pushed him forward every morning at 5:30 when the alarm went off was simple Sophia. Her asthma inhaler on the kitchen counter, her sketchbook full of rocket ships and planets, the way she talked about getting out one day, going to NASA, or at least to a place where the air didn't taste like metal after a storm. The first crack in his silence came on a Tuesday over stale donuts in the break room. A contractor from out of town was bragging loudly into his phone about a done deal to reopen the old Ridgeway chemical site, same ground Lena used to walk past on her way to the bus stop. New name, new logo, same smokestacks. Later that afternoon, Daniel found a glossy flyer taped crookedly to a bulletin board at City Hall when he stopped in to file a work report, Community Information Session, Northridge Advanced Materials Project, Town Hall, Thursday, 7 p.m. Learn how this partnership will bring 500 jobs to Millstone. He stared at the smiling stock photo family printed across the bottom. No mention of emissions, no mention of groundwater, and in small print, almost an afterthought, environmental impact documentation available upon request. Daniel pulled the flyer down, folded it into his pocket, and walked back to his truck with a knot in his stomach. He knew in that moment that if he stayed quiet again, it wouldn't just be his past he was running from. It would be his daughter's future. Daniel felt the weight of that folded flyer long after he'd gone home, long after Sophia had fallen asleep on the couch, with her inhaler resting beside her hand. He sat at the kitchen table with only the hum of the refrigerator for company, turning the flyer over and over until the paper went soft at the edges. He didn't know what he expected to find in it, some hidden confession, some line of fine print that would ease the knot in his stomach. But all it said was what corporations always said: hope, jobs, progress. Words that looked good until you breathed in the chemicals that came with them. By morning, he'd convinced himself he was overreacting. Men like him didn't stop deals backed by lobbyists and three-ring binders. He fixed pipes. He checked water pressure. He made coffee for a team of guys who all carried knees ruined by years of crouching in mud. Changing the course of a multi-million-dollar project felt like trying to stop a freight train with a rake. But 2 days later, the freight train caught up to him. It started with a staff meeting, one called abruptly without notice. The city management conference room still smelled of burned coffee when Daniel and his crew filed in. Standing near the front was a man no one recognized. Pressed gray suit, slick hair, the kind of self-satisfied smile that came with a corner office and an expense account. "Good morning," the stranger said, tapping the whiteboard like teachers do when they want a silent class. "I'm Robert Lang from Northridge. I'll be overseeing infrastructure coordination during the transition phase." Daniel exchanged a glance with his foreman, Walt, who scratched at his beard like he did whenever he sensed political nonsense coming. Transition phase. What? Transition phase, Robert continued. "We'll be evaluating where your existing systems need upgrades to meet our operational needs. Efficiency is vital. We know you're used to slower methods, but we're here to modernize." Slower methods. The words landed with the soft cruelty of someone who'd never crawled through a flooded culvert at 3 a.m. Daniel tightened his jaw. Someone asked what this meant for staffing. Robert gave a vague answer about realignment and matching skill sets to scaled operations, which everyone in that room recognized as code for cuts. He even did it with a smile. Then came the moment that changed the temperature of the whole room. Robert gestured toward a stack of binders. "We'll begin by reviewing contamination risk maps for the city's water system. My team put these together. They're pretty straightforward even for those without technical training. Even for those without technical training." Daniel felt something go tight across his chest. Not anger exactly, but the familiar sweep of dismissal he'd seen his whole life directed at men in steel-toe boots. But this time it hit differently. Because he actually did have technical training. Years of it. Because he'd rebuilt sections of the city's water system after the floods. Because he'd spent nights studying schematics so he could fix problems before they became disasters. And because this man hadn't even bothered to ask. Walt nudged him. He doesn't know who he's talking to. Daniel just gave a small shake of his head. He'd learned not to rise to comments like that, not in rooms where decisions were already made. But then Robert said something he couldn't let pass. "Our chemical storage facility will sit well within EPA tolerances. The plume risk you might have heard residents worrying about. Not an issue unless someone here." He glanced directly at Daniel, is misinforming the public. A few heads turned. Not accusingly, but confused. Daniel's stomach dropped. "I never—" he began, but Robert cut him off with a raised hand. "Look," Robert said, his voice echoing with the confidence of someone used to winning arguments by sheer force of authority. This town wants jobs. We're bringing them. If a few people cling to outdated environmental fears, that's a personal choice. But we won't let that derail a project this community desperately needs. Daniel wanted to ask what part of the community he'd talked to. Certainly not the families in the Ridgeway apartments whose kids lined up outside the clinic twice a month for inhalers. Certainly not the elderly residents whose basements flooded with rust-tinted water after every storm. But he said nothing. Not because he was afraid, but because 10 pairs of eyes were now on him waiting to see if he'd confirm the accusation. The meeting ended with handshakes, forced smiles, and the kind of scripted optimism that big companies imported like plastic swag. Daniel lingered only long enough to gather his toolbox before heading back to the truck. Outside, Walt caught up with him. "You okay, kid?" Daniel was 37, but Walt still called him kid. "They're gonna steamroll this whole place," Walt said, "and they'll expect us to nod along while they do it." Daniel didn't answer, because what he wanted to say felt dangerous. He didn't just disagree with Northridge's plans, he believed they were hiding something. By the time he picked up Sophia from school, the sun had dipped low over the smokestack skyline, casting long shadows across the parking lot. She ran to him carrying a poster board covered in planets and hand-drawn equations. "Daddy, look," she said. "I got picked for the science showcase." He smiled, really smiled, and lifted her up. "I'm proud of you, Mija." She chattered the whole drive home, animated and breathless, telling him how her teacher said her project had real promise. But when they walked through the door of their apartment, she paused. It wasn't obvious at first, but Daniel saw the shift immediately, the slight clutch of her chest, the subtle inhale she tried to disguise. "You okay?" he asked, kneeling down. "Just a little tight," she admitted. "Maybe from running today." He fetched her inhaler, waited for her breathing to settle, then helped her onto the couch. She leaned against him, hair still smelling faintly of crayons and cafeteria pizza. "Did they spray outside today?" he asked gently. She nodded. The janitor said something about new sealant on the playground. It smelled weird. Another knot tightened inside him. He carried that tension back to work the next morning only to find a notice taped to his locker mandatory attendance at Northridge's community partnership briefing that evening. He didn't like the wording. He liked the time even less, 6:00 p.m. smack in the middle of dinner and homework. At the briefing held in the old high school gym, the bleachers were half filled with city employees and a scattering of residents. A huge banner read, "Welcome to Millstone's new era." Daniel sat near the back with Sophia beside him, wrapped in her favorite NASA hoodie. She swung her feet idly, not yet sensing the heaviness in the room. Executives took turns giving polished speeches about opportunity and innovation. They rolled out digital slides showing graphs and projections that didn't match the reality of the crumbling neighborhoods just outside the school doors. Then during the Q&A, a woman asked about groundwater contamination risks. Robert stepped up to the microphone with that same condescending smile. "There's nothing to be concerned about," he said. "Our data models show no significant impact. Any reports you've heard to the contrary are exaggerated." Daniel felt heat rise along his neck. Because he recognized the model projected on the screen, an outdated template that didn't account for the fractured bedrock beneath the old Ridgeway site. Without proper adjustments, it underestimated plume dispersion by half. He waited for someone else to notice. No one did. Sophia tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, "why do they keep saying everything's safe if you don't think it is?" Her voice was so small, and somehow that question asked in a crowded gym with the hum of fluorescent lights overhead landed harder than anything Robert had said. "I don't know," he answered quietly. but I'm going to find out." When the meeting adjourned, Daniel gathered their things ready to slip out before anyone cornered him. But they didn't make it to the doors. Robert intercepted them. "Well," he said with a forced smile, "look who showed up." Still stirring concern behind the scenes, Daniel kept his tone even. "I'm here like everyone else." "Of course," Robert said. Then he knelt, slightly addressing Sophia with a soft chuckle. "Your dad gets worried about things he doesn't understand. Engineers like us handle the big stuff." Sophia's eyes widened. She shrank closer to Daniel, confused and embarrassed. Daniel felt something inside him tighten. Not a burst of anger, something quieter, colder. The feeling of being dismissed was familiar, but having his daughter see it, having a stranger undermine him in front of her, that dug deeper. "We're leaving," Daniel said, steering Sophia away. "Good idea," Robert replied. "Let the adults work." The words lingered like smoke. Outside in the parking lot, under the buzzing sodium lights, Sophia looked up at him and asked Daddy, "Why did he talk to you like that?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He couldn't. His throat felt tight. Because he saw the harm now, not theoretical, not environmental, but personal. The way bad power teaches a child to doubt the people who protect her. He opened the truck door, helped her climb in, and sat there for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at nothing. He'd tried staying quiet. He'd tried being patient. He'd tried trusting the process. But tonight, something had shifted. The pressure had been building for days, disrespect at work, misleading data, the future of Millstone being rewritten without truth or consent. And now his daughter had watched a man in a suit call him small. Somewhere deep in his chest, a line snapped. Daniel put the truck in gear, knowing exactly where he needed to go next, and knowing that once he took the next step, there would be no going back. Daniel drove through Millstone with the quiet intensity of a man who'd run out of angles left to swallow. The town rolled past his headlights in a blur. Cracked brick storefronts, shuttered factories, empty playgrounds where swings moved only when the wind pushed them. He headed toward the Ridgeway site, the same way he used to walk toward the steel mill on graveyard shifts, jaw tight, fists clenched, knowing something was about to change, and he needed to be ready for it. Sophia had fallen asleep in the passenger seat, her breathing finally steady. He left the radio off, letting the darkness fill the cab like water. Tonight wasn't about speeches or warnings. It wasn't about trying to convince men who had already decided they didn't have to listen. Tonight was about truth. He parked outside the chain-link gate that surrounded the old chemical facility. The no trespassing signs looked new, printed with Northridge's logo. Floodlights cast long, eerie shadows over crumbling concrete and rusted vats. The place smelled faintly of solvent, even from where he stood. He took a long breath. His father used to tell him, if something scares you, it's usually because it matters. He didn't know if that was wisdom or just something men said so they could pretend their fear meant something noble. But right now it was enough. He checked the truck again to make sure Sophia was still sleeping. She curled slightly toward the door, her NASA hoodie wrapped around her chin. He whispered that he'd be right back, even though she couldn't hear him, and slipped through a gap in the fence he'd noticed weeks ago on a job inspection. The ground inside felt wrong beneath his boots, soft in places where it should have been solid. That was the thing about sites like Ridgeway. Nature remembered what had been buried, even if people tried to forget. As he moved deeper, a harsh mechanical hum hit his ears. Generators. Northridge hadn't just surveyed the site, they were already working. That realization brought the first spike of dread. If they were operating equipment without the city's oversight, There was something worse going on than outdated data models. He followed the sound around the side of a storage building, crouching behind a stack of pallets. Two workers in Northridge jackets stood by a temporary pump rig, one smoking, one checking a pressure gauge. Between them, giant flexible hoses burrowed underground like veins feeding a heart no one had asked for. He heard the smoker say, "We've got to move faster. If the board wants this cleared by inspection next week, we can't wait for permits." "Should have been cleared months ago," the other replied. "But nobody wants to touch the drums down there. Heard they're still hot." Daniel froze. Drums. Hot. That meant one thing: reactive waste, the kind that wasn't supposed to be anywhere near open air. His heart pounded so hard he felt it in his teeth. He glanced back the way he came, every instinct screaming to go grab Sophia and run. But he didn't move. Because running was what he'd done 5 years ago, when Lena's doctors said words like environmental exposure and long-term contamination. He'd run from the idea that the place he worked might have played a part in her illness. He'd buried himself in extra shifts instead of demanding answers. And he wasn't going to run now. He waited until the workers drifted toward the other side of the structure, then crept forward. The pressure gauge on the temporary pump was trembling higher than it should have. He traced the line of the hose with his eyes, following it to a hatch in the ground. Its metal cover warped the paint, peeling back like burnt skin. Something below was leaking pressure. Something below was wrong. He knelt down and touched the hatch. It was warm. His stomach dropped. If the workers didn't know what they were tapping into, or worse, if they didn't care, this could turn catastrophic fast. Old storage tanks weren't predictable. A buildup of gas, a chemical reaction, a spark from any of the machines humming nearby. One wrong move, and the whole site could blow. He eased the latch open just enough to shine his phone's light inside. A thick vapor drifted upward in slow curls, catching the beam like smoke in a movie theater. Far below, he saw the edge of a cracked drum, its lid buckling upward under internal pressure. There wasn't time to think. The pressure gauge screamed upward, needle hitting the red. He didn't hear the workers until one shouted, "Hey, who the hell?" He jumped back as the ground quivered under him, a shudder moving through the soil like a warning growl. The first worker sprinted toward him. "Get away from that! Are you trying to kill us?" Daniel pointed toward the swelling gauge. "You tapped a compromised tank. That pump is feeding pressure back into a sealed drum." But they stared at him as if he'd spoken a foreign language. "We're trained," the smoker said, puffed up with false confidence. "We know what we're doing." "No," Daniel said, stepping between them and the hatch. "You don't." He reached for the emergency shutoff valve on the pump rig. The worker grabbed his wrist. "Touch that, and you're fired, arrested." The ground rumbled again, harder. Daniel looked at the worker with a clarity that didn't feel like bravery. It felt like inevitability. There won't be anyone left to fire. He drove his shoulder forward, breaking the man's grip, and slammed his palm against the emergency shutoff. The pump shrieked to a stop. Silence fell thick, anxious, electric. For half a second, nothing happened. Then the ruptured drum below gave a violent metallic pop. A column of vapor shot upward through the hatch like a geyser. The force knocked Daniel backward into the dirt. One worker screamed. The other threw his arm over his face. And Daniel saw it, the spark. Either from a loose wire, or a metal tool hitting concrete, or the sheer friction of pressure release, a single flash. Then fire. Instinct took over. He pushed off the ground and lunged at the nearest worker, yanking him away from the hatch, just as flames roared upward in a pillar of orange. The other tried to run blindly right toward the chemical pit. Daniel caught him by the back of his jacket, pulling so hard he felt something tear in his shoulder. The fire whooshed higher, twisting like a snake, hungry for oxygen. He dragged both men behind an overturned concrete barrier and dropped down, covering his head, as heat blasted past them. The world went white-orange for a second. Then silence. Not real silence. The kind after a shockwave, when your ears can't understand the world anymore. Daniel blinked hard. The fire hadn't spread. The burst had vented pressure but hadn't ignited the whole tank system. They were alive. His chest heaved, his pulse hammered. But they were alive. The workers stared at him, stunned. One tried to speak but only managed a croaked, "You?" Saved Daniel wasn't listening anymore, because headlights were approaching the gate, fast. And not security headlights, city vehicles, fire trucks. And behind them, he recognized the silhouette, even from here, Robert Lang's shiny black sedan. Daniel stood on unsteady legs as first responders swarmed the area. Someone shouted orders. Someone else dragged hoses toward the smoldering hatch. But the moment Robert stepped through the gate, everything shifted. His eyes swept the wreckage, the equipment, the trembling workers, and finally landed on Daniel. "What have you done?" Robert hissed. Daniel opened his mouth, but a fire captain cut in. "This man pulled your crew out of the blast zone," she said, pointing at Daniel. "And if he hadn't shut down that pump when he did, we'd be pulling bodies out of here instead." The captain's words hung in the air like an indictment. For the first time since meeting him, Daniel saw Robert speechless. Behind them, a small voice called out, "Daddy!" Sophia was running toward him. Someone from the fire crew must have pulled her from the truck when she woke. She threw herself into his arms, shaking. "I saw the fire," she said into his chest. "I thought..." He held her tight, his breath catching. This moment right here was why he stepped into danger. This was the promise he'd made to Lena. This was the reason he wouldn't stay quiet anymore. When he finally looked back up, half the emergency crew was staring at him with a mixture of disbelief and respect. And Robert Lang, whose confidence had survived every challenge until tonight, looked suddenly very small. The power dynamic had shifted. Everyone saw it. Everyone felt it. And Daniel Reyes, still covered in dirt and ash, stood at the center of it, no longer invisible, no longer dismissed, just a man who'd done the right thing when no one else would. The consequences would come next. But for the first time, he knew he wasn't facing them alone. The night air at the Ridgeway site felt strange after the explosion, heavy metallic carrying the faint, sweet, burnt smell that clung to the back of your throat. Fire crews moved with organized urgency, their radios chirping in quick bursts. The worker Daniel had dragged away sat on the ground, shaking his hands, still covered in dust. The other paced in small circles, muttering the same line over and over. It was gonna blow. It was gonna blow. But beyond the chaos, there was a second kind of hush, rising an undercurrent of disbelief running through every set of eyes, now fixed on Daniel Reyes. The captain, a woman with soot smeared across her helmet, came back over. "Your actions prevented a chain reaction," she said. "We've never seen readings this unstable." If that pump had run another minute, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Her gaze held the weight of what almost happened. More responders approached. A paramedic offered Daniel a blanket he didn't realize he was shivering for. Another pressed oxygen toward him, but he waved it away gently, pointing toward the workers instead. "I'm fine," he murmured, still holding Sophia, who clung so tightly, her fingers dug into his jacket. "Take care of them." That sentence alone shifted the energy around him. This wasn't bravado. It wasn't defiance. It was the calm certainty of someone who had already accepted the cost of stepping forward. Robert Lang, however, moved through the scene with a different kind of tension, his polished shoes crunching over debris, his expression drawn tight at the edges. He looked desperate to find someone to blame, and equally desperate for it not to be himself. He pointed at Daniel. "This man has interfered with a restricted operation. He forced an emergency shutdown without clearance. He endangered this entire site." The fire captain stared at him with a look so flat it could slice stone. "Sir," she said slowly, "if he hadn't hit that shutoff, we'd be hauling body bags." Robert's jaw flexed. He opened his mouth, perhaps to argue, perhaps to retreat, but before he could speak, one of the workers he'd hired stepped forward. "He saved us," the man choked out. "We didn't listen. We didn't know. We were running pressure into a sealed tank. We didn't even check the integrity scan like he told us." "He told you," the captain interrupted. Daniel's head snapped up. He hadn't meant for that to come out, but it did. Both workers nodded. He said the readings were wrong, said the ground was unstable, said the drum was hot. Robert turned slowly to Daniel, eyes narrowing. "And how exactly would you know that you're a maintenance worker, not an engineer?" A strange silence fell. Sophia shifted in her father's arms, pulling back just enough to look at him. She didn't say a word, but her wide eyes asked one simple question. "Daddy, what is he talking about?" Daniel exhaled. He had been avoiding this moment for years longer, maybe. It wasn't that he wanted to hide anything. It was that the truth tied him to the ugliest chapter of his life. But if he didn't say it now, the lie of who he was supposed to be would keep drowning out the truth of what mattered. He set Sophia gently on her feet and stood straighter than he had all night. "I'm not just a maintenance worker," he said quietly. "I was a structural diagnostics engineer at the old Millstone steel plant. I designed safety protocols, risk models, and containment systems before they shut us down." People turned. Responders paused. Even the air seemed to still. Robert blinked, thrown off balance. "Then why in God's name are you working for the city water department?" Daniel met his eyes. "Because after the plant closed, my wife got sick. Very sick. And instead of fighting the system that poisoned half her co-workers, I took whatever job let me be home with her. I didn't want to model risk anymore. I didn't want to spend another day thinking about what could go wrong underground or behind factory walls. All I wanted was to keep her breathing, keep our life together from falling apart." He swallowed voice tight. "And after she passed, I didn't want to be anywhere near a job where people ignored warnings." A few responders looked away, not out of discomfort, but out of respect. Robert, however, stared like someone watching their carefully built narrative collapse plank by plank. "Then you understand how critical it is not to interfere with—" "I interfered because you were wrong," Daniel cut in. "Not loud, not aggressive, simply factual. You weren't pumping runoff. You were pressurizing a decayed drum that was already compromised. You didn't account for fractured bedrock. You didn't check thermal variance. You didn't even run a geological assessment." The captain raised her brow. "You saw all that in 2 minutes." "1 minute," Daniel corrected. "The pump was vibrating too high for a stable feed. The pressure gauge was trembling instead of climbing steadily. The soil temperature didn't match ambient. And the hatch was giving off vapor before I opened it." A murmur rippled through the group, astonishment, maybe admiration. Robert's face went red. "You're guessing?" "No," Daniel said. "I'm remembering. This is exactly how the failures started at Millstone Steel. The readings, the vapor, the drain-back pressure. I've seen this pattern before, and once you've seen it—" He paused. "You never forget it." It was then, when he finally looked up, that he realized the shift had already begun. The workers who'd dismissed him earlier now regarded him with something close to awe. The paramedic who tried to hand him oxygen earlier nodded at him like he was the one who'd taught half the room how to breathe. Even the fire crew trained to walk into chaos without hesitation looked shaken by the knowledge of what had almost happened and by the man who stopped it. And then, perhaps most surprising of all, the city manager arrived. Her sedan screeched to a halt at the gate, and she hurried toward them, coat thrown half over her shoulders. She scanned the scene, then locked onto Daniel and froze. "Reyes," she said, breathless. "They told me you were involved, but what in the world happened here?" Before Daniel could answer, the fire captain stepped forward. This man prevented a mass casualty event. The city manager blinked. The sentence didn't seem to compute. What? "He saved my men," one of the workers said, voice trembling. "We'd be dead if not for him, and he shut down a faulty system before it triggered secondary ignition," the captain added. More eyes turned toward him. More realization dawned. More shame pooled around Robert's feet. The city manager stared at Daniel as if seeing him for the first time. "Reyes, why didn't you ever tell us you had this background?" Daniel shrugged. Didn't think it mattered anymore. "It matters now," she said firmly. "A hell of a lot," Robert finally snapped. "This is absurd," he barked. "He broke protocol. He trespassed. He disrupted an active operation. He saved your employees," the city manager interrupted sharply, "and exposed a violation that could cost this city millions. It happened fast, so fast, it felt like watching a tide shift in a single breath. A man who'd built his authority on polished confidence suddenly had none. And a man who'd been overlooked, dismissed, spoken down to for weeks, stood taller than anyone else on the field. That was the moment the tables turned. "You're done," the city manager told Robert. "Effective immediately. Turn over every document your team has touched, and pray there's nothing else like this buried out here, because from this moment on, we're not taking your word for anything." She turned to Daniel again, her voice lowering. "I'm putting together an independent investigation. We'll need someone who understands this terrain, someone who sees risks before anyone else does, someone who just proved they can act under pressure." She paused. "I want you on that team." Daniel didn't respond right away. His heart pounded not with fear now, but with something different, something he hadn't felt in years. The idea of stepping back into the world he'd abandoned scared him, but the idea of staying silent after tonight, that scared him more. Before he could answer, Sophia tugged his jacket sleeve. "Daddy." He knelt. "Yeah, sweet pea." Her voice was barely above a breath. "Are you gonna help them so the town doesn't get sick like Mom did?" His lungs tightened, not from smoke, from love. He pulled her close, pressing his cheek to her hair. "Yes," he whispered. "I think I am." When he rose, he met the city manager's eyes. "We'll talk," he said. "Tomorrow. But tonight, I need to get my daughter home." "Of course," she replied softly. "And Daniel?" He looked back. "Millstone owes you more than you know." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because for the first time in a very long time, he could feel the ground beneath him shifting, and not in the dangerous way he'd learned to fear. Something new was breaking open. Opportunity. Responsibility. A chance to rebuild not just the town, but himself. By morning, word of the Ridgeway incident had spread through Millstone like a wind that carried both fear and relief. The city manager called an emergency press conference on the steps of City Hall, flanked by fire officials and environmental inspectors. What surprised Daniel wasn't the crowd. It was the number of people who stopped him on his way in. A school custodian clasped his hand and said, "My nephew works nights out there. "Thank you." A nurse from the clinic added, "We've seen too many sick kids already. You did what no one else would." Shop owners nodded at him, with a respect he hadn't felt since long before the steel plant shut down. Sophia held his hand the whole way, smiling shyly, every time someone thanked her father. It wasn't pride she carried, it was relief. Relief that her dad wasn't invisible to the world anymore. Relief that the man she trusted most had finally been seen for who he really was. The press conference was brief. The city manager publicly announced a full halt on Northridge's operations pending the investigation. She confirmed chemical safety violations and credited the quick, decisive action of City Water Department technician Daniel Reyes, words that caught in his throat when he heard them aloud. Behind her, Robert Lang stood stiffly with two corporate attorneys. He wouldn't meet anyone's eye. Whatever happened next would be handled in courtrooms, not job sites. The pride that once carried him had nowhere left to go. After the cameras shut off, the city manager pulled Daniel aside. "I meant what I said last night," she told him. "I want you on the independent review team. And when this investigation is over, if you want it, the city needs a director of infrastructure safety, someone who sees danger before it's too late." For years, Daniel had avoided returning to that world. But now the idea didn't feel like reopening a wound. It felt like honoring the life he'd nearly lost, and the one he was still raising. "I'll think about it," he told her gently. "But thank you," she smiled. "You saved a lot of lives, Reyes. We need people like you." Sophia tugged his sleeve again. "Daddy, can we go home now? I want to show you my new project idea." He nodded. "Yeah, sweet pea. Let's go home." Weeks passed, then months, and the investigation unfolded piece by piece. Northridge saw executives resign, lawsuits filed, environmental auditors sweeping every inch of Ridgeway's soil. But the biggest shift came closer to home. Residents formed committees to demand transparency. Retired workers came forward about past spills. The idea that nothing could change began to feel less like a truth and more like an excuse people had finally outgrown. Daniel accepted the city manager's offer, first as a consultant, then formally as director of infrastructure safety. His first act was simple, but symbolic. He brought the old engineering manuals from his steel plant, days out of storage, and stacked them on his new desk. Sophia helped place them, running a small hand over the cracked spines. "These look important," she said. "They are," he replied. "They kept people safe." "And now you will too," she said, matter-of-fact, in the way only children could manage. They moved into a modest 3-bedroom house on the east side of town. Nothing fancy, but full of sunlight and close to her school. She decorated her room with constellations and taped her science fair ribbons to the wall. Daniel started jogging again in the mornings, breathing easier with each mile. Some days he even found himself humming while he cooked dinner, something he hadn't done since Lena was alive. One afternoon, a letter arrived from an unexpected sender. It was from the family of a Northridge worker Daniel had saved. A handwritten note. The worker's wife thanked him for giving their daughters the chance to grow up with their father, and the card held a photograph of the family at the county fair. Everyone was smiling. It was a simple thing, but Daniel set the picture beside his desk lamp where the sunlight hit it every morning. Months later, when the city council voted unanimously to adopt new safety protocols based on Daniel's recommendations, he sat in the back row with Sophia beside him. No applause, no ceremony, just a quiet vote that changed how Millstone would treat its own people for decades. On the walk out, a councilman he barely knew stopped him. "Reyes, whatever comes next, this town's stronger because of you." Daniel didn't answer. He just nodded, humbled in a way he hadn't expected to be. A year after the explosion, The Ridgeway site was finally declared stable. Wild grasses had begun to reclaim the edges of the lot. Sophia, now a little taller, a little bolder, joined him on a hill overlooking the place where everything had changed. "Do you miss the old job?" she asked. He thought about the nights repairing pipes in silence, the comfort of familiar tools, the simplicity of problems he could solve with his hands. "A little," he said. "But I like this life better." She smiled, leaning against him. "You know," she said softly, "Mom would be proud." The words hit him gently like a door opening in a room he'd kept closed too long. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Yeah," he whispered. "I hope so." They stood together in the breeze, looking down at the land that had once threatened everything, and instead had given them something new. A second chance, a purpose reclaimed, a life rebuilt not from fear, but from truth. In the distance, a truck rumbled past, carrying new soil to a community garden project his team had approved. A simple reminder that repair was possible, that healing could happen inch by inch. And as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Daniel understood something he hadn't been able to name before. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stop running from who they were so they can finally become who they were meant to be.